The waitress did not bother hiding her disgust. "Sir," she said, her voice cutting across the dining room like shattering glass, "are you aware this restaurant has a dress code?" It was not a question. It was an accusation. The old man stood frozen at the hostess stand, rainwater dripping from his peacoat onto the marble floor, pooling around boots held together with duct tape and determination. In his scarred hands he clutched a single rose, wilted and bought from a gas station 3 miles back. What this waitress did not know, what no one in this restaurant knew, was that the man she was publicly humiliating had once held his breath for 4 minutes in black water to plant explosives on an enemy vessel, while 6 of his teammates bled out on the extraction boat waiting for him to surface. His name was Earl Cafferty, 71 years old, former Master Chief Petty Officer. 34 years of service to a country that had largely forgotten he existed. Tonight he wore everything he owned, layers of charity and necessity, and none of it matched the crystal chandeliers or white tablecloths surrounding him. But he had not walked 3 miles in the rain for the ambience. The waitress, whose name tag read Brittany, placed one manicured hand on her hip. She was young, maybe 24, with the kind of confidence that comes from never having been truly tested. Her eyes swept over him like he was something to be scraped off a shoe. "Well," she pressed, "can I help you or not?" Earl's voice came out rough from disuse. "Table for one, please. Corner booth if you have it." Brittany laughed. It was not a kind sound. "The corner booth," she repeated, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Sir, that booth is reserved for our preferred guests." She let the implication hang in the air like smoke. Earl did not flinch. His hands, webbed with scars that mapped decades of service, remained steady on the rose stem. "If you have anything available, ma'am," he said quietly, "I would appreciate it." Something about the way he said ma'am caught her off guard. The automatic respect, the military precision of it. But she recovered quickly, her smile sharpening. "Fine, follow me." And she turned on her heel without waiting. She led him past the good tables, past the couples in evening wear, past the businessmen closing deals over bourbon. She led him to the worst table in the house, a tiny two-top wedged beside the kitchen doors where servers rushed past every 30 seconds and the smell of industrial dishwasher cut through the expensive aromatics. She dropped a menu on the table without ceremony. "Your server will be with you," she said. Then, just loud enough for the neighboring table to hear, eventually, Earl lowered himself into the chair slowly. His knees protested, old injuries announcing themselves. He positioned himself automatically with his back to the wall, eyes on every exit, a habit so ingrained he no longer noticed doing it. The rose he set carefully in the center of the table, adjusting it twice until it sat just right. If the placement bothered Brittany, she did not show it. She was already walking away, already scanning the room for more important customers. At the next table, a man in his 60s paused mid-conversation with his wife. Pastor Raymond Okonkwo had spent 20 years as a Navy chaplain before retiring to run a veterans outreach program. He knew how to read men, especially broken ones. And something about the old man by the kitchen doors made him set down his fork. "The way he sits," Raymond murmured to his wife. "Back to the wall. Eyes on the exits." His wife glanced over. "He looks homeless, Ray." Raymond nodded slowly. "That too. But look at his hands. Look at how still they are." Across the restaurant, a young woman named Sophia Chun was filming a review for her food blog. 200,000 followers watched her document the culinary landscape of the coastal elite. Tonight, she had planned to showcase the restaurant's signature dishes. But her camera had drifted toward the confrontation at the hostess stand, and something told her to keep recording. Earl sat alone with his wilted rose and his water glass, still wearing his damp peacoat because he had nothing suitable underneath. He did not look at the menu. He already knew what he would order. The cheapest appetizer and 1 glass of house red. Exactly what he could afford. His hand moved unconsciously to his chest, pressing against the layers of fabric until he felt it. The chain, the ring, the tags. Margaret's wedding band hung between his own dog tags and a second pair that had not belonged to him for 40 years. 3 pieces of metal. Two ghosts. One broken man, still carrying them both. 43 years ago tonight, in this very restaurant, he had asked Margaret Ellen Rhodes to marry him. She said yes before he finished the question. Brittany returned with a water glass, setting it down hard enough to splash. She pulled out her notepad with exaggerated patience. "The special tonight is the ribeye," she announced. "Market price." Then her eyes swept over his clothes again and her lip curled. "Maybe you should stick to the soup." Earl met her gaze. Something flickered there, deep behind his eyes, a flash of steel that came and went so quickly she almost missed it. "The soup sounds fine, ma'am. And a glass of the house red, please." Brittany scribbled on her pad. "Cash or card?" "Cash." She looked at him for a long moment. "We will need to see it up front." Her voice carried. New policy. It was not a new policy. They both knew it. Earl reached into his coat with the same deliberate precision he had once used to defuse explosives underwater. He produced a worn leather wallet, extracted several creased bills, and held them up for her inspection. His hands did not shake. They never shook. Brittany snatched the money, counted it twice, and shoved it in her apron. "I will bring your wine," she said. And then she was gone, leaving Earl alone with his rose and his ghosts and the weight of 43 years pressing down on his shoulders. At his table by the window, Pastor Okonkwo was still watching. "Something is wrong with that picture," he said softly. His wife touched his arm. "Wrong how?" Raymond shook his head. "I have seen 1,000 broken veterans. That man is broken, yes. But underneath the broken, there is something else." He paused, searching for the right word. Something dangerous. In the kitchen, the owner was finishing his nightly review of the accounts. Vincent Hargrave, 58 years old, former Navy lieutenant commander. He had bought this restaurant 15 years ago with his retirement savings and his father's life insurance. On his office wall hung a photograph for 1991. Desert Storm. 17 young men in desert camouflage, arms around each other, alive because someone had refused to leave them behind. He did not know that one of those someones was sitting at the worst table in his restaurant, clutching a dead rose and waiting for a glass of wine he could barely afford. But in exactly 9 minutes, he would find out, and everything in this restaurant would change. The wine arrived in a glass that had not been properly polished. Brittany set it down without comment, a small rebellion, a reminder of his place in her hierarchy of customers worth caring about. "Earl, thank her anyway." She was already gone before the words left his mouth. He lifted the glass slowly, watching the light catch the deep red. Margaret had loved wine. Not expensive wine, not the bottles that cost more than his weekly pay, but the simple ones. The ones they could afford when they were young and stationed in Virginia, and the whole world seemed like a promise waiting to be kept. If you're watching this story from anywhere in the world, know that stories like this one happen in every community. Hidden heroes walk among us every day, and we rarely recognize them until it is too late. If you would like to see more stories that honor the forgotten among us, consider subscribing. Now let us continue. The first sip tasted like memory. 43 years collapsed into a single moment. He had been 28 years old, already a decade into his service, already carrying the weight of operations that would never be declassified. Margaret was a nurse at the Naval Medical Center, tough as deck plating and twice as steady. She had seen him carried in after Grenada, unconscious, bleeding from wounds he would not explain. She had sat beside his bed for 3 days, waiting for him to wake up. When he finally opened his eyes, she was reading a paperback novel and eating his Jell-O. "You owe me a Jell-O," she had said. That was the first thing. Not "Are you okay?" Not "What happened?" Just "You owe me a Jell-O." And he knew right then that he would marry her. Earl set the wine glass down and reached into his coat. The photograph was worn soft at the edges, laminated years ago when the paper started to crack. 2 faces. His own, young and unlined, wearing dress whites that still fit properly. Hers, laughing in a blue sundress, her hand already reaching for his. The day he shipped out for Grenada, she had pressed this photograph into his hands. "Come back to me," she said. "That is an order, sailor." He had kept that order for 30 years. Through Vietnam, through Grenada, through Panama, through the Gulf, through operations that did not exist on any map, extractions that would remain classified until everyone involved was dead. He had kept that order through nights underwater with his lungs burning and his team, depending on him, and the mission screaming for completion. He had kept that order because Margaret was waiting, because the photograph was in his pocket, because some promises are worth more than breath. But 6 years ago, the cancer came, and for the first time in his life, Master Chief Earl Cafferty faced an enemy he could not fight, could not shoot, could not outswim or outlast or outmaneuver. She died on a Tuesday morning in April. He was holding her hand. Her last words were, "Take care of yourself, Earl. Promise me." He had broken that promise every day since. The soup arrived. Brittany dropped it on the table with enough force to send broth sloshing over the rim. She did not apologize. She did not offer napkins. She simply raised one eyebrow at the photograph in his hands and said, "Will there be anything else?" Earl tucked Margaret back into his coat, next to his heart where she had always been. "No, ma'am," he said. "Thank you." Brittany lingered for a moment, her curiosity briefly overriding her contempt. "Waiting for someone?" she asked. The question was almost human. Earl looked at the empty chair across from him. "Just remembering someone," he said quietly. Whatever flicker of humanity had sparked in Brittany's eyes extinguished immediately. "Well, try to remember faster. We have customers waiting for tables." She gestured vaguely at the half-empty restaurant and walked away. At the next table, Pastor Okonkwo had stopped pretending to eat. His wife noticed his attention drifting and followed his gaze. "Raymond," she said softly, "you cannot save everyone." "I know," he replied, "but some people are not asking to be saved. They are asking to be seen." The old man by the kitchen doors was not eating his soup. He was staring at the empty chair across from him like it contained a ghost. His lips moved silently, words meant for someone who was no longer there to hear them. Raymond reached into his jacket and withdrew a business card. The logo was a trident, the symbol of the Navy SEALs, repurposed for his outreach program. He had helped hundreds of veterans over the years. The broken ones, the lost ones, the ones who had given everything and been forgotten by the country they served. Something told him the man at that table had given more than most. Earl's hand found the chain around his neck again. 3 pieces of metal pressed against his chest. Margaret's ring, thin gold worn smooth by 40 years on her finger. His own dog tags, still bearing his blood type and service number. And a second pair of tags that had not belonged to him since 1983. Tommy Reyes, Petty Officer 2nd Class. The best swimmer Earl had ever trained. The closest thing he had to a brother. Grenada. Operation Urgent Fury. October 25th, 1983. They had gone in by water, a 6-man SEAL team tasked with underwater demolition of enemy patrol boats. The intelligence was wrong. There were supposed to be 4 boats. There were 8. They adapted. They always adapted. But during extraction, everything went sideways. Earl could still hear the gunfire, could still feel the impact as rounds tore through the water around him, could still see Tommy's face when the bullet found him, the surprise more than the pain, the way his hand reached out for something to hold on to. Earl had grabbed that hand, had dragged Tommy 200 meters to the extraction boat with one arm, while the other applied pressure to a wound that would not stop bleeding, had held him in a helicopter as the medic worked frantically and the light faded from Tommy's eyes. "Tell Maria I almost made it home," Tommy had whispered, "and teach my boy to fish." Those were the last words. 30 seconds later, Petty Officer Tommy Reyes was gone. Earl had kept that promise too. 3 years after the operation was declassified, he tracked down Maria Reyes and her son Tommy Jr. He taught that boy to fish every summer until the boy turned 18 and enlisted in the Navy himself, following in footsteps he never knew his father had made. The soup was cold now. Earl had not touched it. His fingers rested on the tags beneath his shirt, tracing the letters of a name that had been carved into his soul for 40 years. "Still here, brother," he whispered to the empty restaurant. Still trying. In the kitchen, Vincent Hargrave closed his ledger and stood from his desk. Time for his nightly walk through the dining room. Time to shake hands and make small talk and ensure his customers felt valued. He straightened his tie and pushed through the swinging doors. His eyes swept the room automatically, cataloging faces, noting empty glasses that needed refilling, observing the rhythm of his staff. And then his gaze landed on the old man by the kitchen doors. Something about the hands, something about the stillness, something that tugged at a memory buried deep, a memory of sand and blood, and a voice in the darkness saying, "Hold on, Lieutenant, I am getting you home." Vincent stopped walking. The old man looked up, and across 40 years and 1,000 miles of distance, something sparked in the space between them. Recognition not yet formed. A question not yet asked. Vincent shook his head, dismissing the sensation. He had customers to attend to. Important customers. Not some vagrant his waitress had been complaining about for the last 20 minutes. He turned toward the bar, but the memory would not let him go. In exactly 4 minutes, he would turn back, and everything would change. Brittany was not finished with him. She returned to Earl's table with the check holder already in hand, slapping it down beside his untouched soup with a sound like a verdict being delivered. "Kitchen is closing soon," she announced. "Figured you would want to settle up." Earl glanced at the check, then at his watch. It was barely 8:30. The posted hours said the kitchen served until 10. Brittany caught his look and doubled down. "Special circumstances," she said brightly. "We need this table." The restaurant was half empty. 3 booths sat completely vacant. A busboy was wiping down tables that had not been used all evening. But Earl did not point this out. He simply nodded and reached for the check holder. At the table by the window, Pastor Okonkwo's wife placed a hand on his arm. "Raymond," she whispered, "do something." Raymond was already rising. He had counseled enough veterans to recognize the signs. The stillness that was not peace. The silence that was not calm. That man was holding himself together with nothing but willpower and muscle memory, and the waitress was systematically dismantling both. But before he could take a step, Brittany escalated. She had noticed Sophia Chen's phone, angled toward the confrontation. In Brittany's mind, this was an opportunity, a chance to demonstrate to her social media audience how efficiently she handled difficult customers, how she maintained the restaurant standards, how she protected the dining experience of people who actually mattered. "Sir," Brittany said, raising her voice so the surrounding tables could hear clearly, "I'm going to have to ask you to pay your bill and leave. Your presence is making our other guests uncomfortable." Earl looked up at her. His eyes were steady, calm, carrying a depth that should have warned her. But Brittany was 24 years old and had never met a problem she could not talk her way around. She did not recognize danger when it sat quietly before her. "I have not finished my meal," Earl said. His voice was soft, but something in it made the busboy stop wiping tables. Brittany laughed. The sound was sharp and theatrical, pitched for the audience she believed was on her side. "Your meal." She gestured at the cold soup, the untouched bread, the single glass of house wine. "Sir, you ordered the cheapest items on our menu. You have been nursing that wine for 40 minutes. And frankly, she leaned in slightly, dropping her voice to a stage whisper that carried perfectly, "I am not convinced you can actually pay for what you have ordered." The dining room had gone quiet. Forks paused midway to mouths. Conversations died mid-sentence. Every eye turned toward the confrontation by the kitchen doors. Earl's hand moved to his chest, pressing against the chain beneath his layers. The tags, the ring, the anchors that kept him moored to a world that had largely stopped seeing him. "I can pay," he said quietly. Brittany straightened, emboldened by the attention. "Then prove it. Show me the cash right now, or I am calling the police for theft of services." The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Theft. The word landed on Earl's shoulders alongside all the other weights he carried. 40 years of service. 34 years of sacrifice. 6 years of grief. And now this girl, this child who had never known a moment of true hardship, was accusing him of being a thief. Something shifted in Earl's posture. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Pastor Okonkwo saw it. The homeless man disappeared. The veteran emerged, shoulders squaring, spine straightening, the muscle memory of 10,000 formations taking hold. "Ma'am," Earl said, and now his voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had commanded warriors. "I have money to pay for my meal. I showed it to you when I arrived. You counted it yourself." Brittany faltered. She had not expected resistance, had not anticipated that the broken old man would push back. Her eyes darted to Sophia Chen's phone, still recording, and she realized suddenly that the narrative might not be going the way she planned. "Well," she stammered. "Well, the policy is—" "There is no policy," Earl said. His voice remained soft, but there was steel beneath it now, bedrock beneath the soft earth. "You seated me at the worst table in the house. You have checked on me twice in 40 minutes. You brought me a dirty glass and cold soup, and now you are accusing me of theft in front of a room full of strangers." Brittany's face flushed red. "How dare you speak to me that way? I am trying to run a respectable establishment, and you're trying to humiliate a man who has done nothing wrong," Earl finished. "And you are succeeding." He paused, letting the words settle. "But that says more about you than it does about me." The silence that followed was absolute. Sophia Chun had stopped breathing, her phone capturing every second. Pastor Okonkwo stood frozen mid-step, watching the old man with new eyes. The other diners sat motionless, their expensive meals forgotten. Brittany's lip trembled. Whether from anger or shame, it was impossible to tell. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, a voice cut across the dining room. "Is there a problem here?" Vincent Hargrave had finally turned back. He stood 15 feet away, his manager's smile fixed in place, but his eyes were locked on the old man's hands. The scarred hands, the steady hands, hands that moved with an economy of motion that seemed hauntingly familiar. "Mr. Hargrave," Brittany said, relief flooding her voice. "This customer is being difficult. He is refusing to pay and making threats, and I really think we should call the—" Vincent held up one hand, silencing her. He took a step closer to Earl's table. Then another. Earl met his gaze without flinching. Something passed between them, a current of recognition that neither could yet name. Vincent's eyes dropped to Earl's forearm, where years of sun and grime could not quite conceal the edges of old ink. His breath caught. "That peacoat," Vincent said slowly. "Navy issue. Korean War era." Earl nodded. "My father's. Before was mine." Vincent took another step closer. "And those hands. I have seen hands like that before. Only one kind of work makes hands like that." The dining room held its breath. Brittany looked between them, confusion replacing her certainty. "Mr. Hargrave, what are you—" Vincent ignored her completely. His attention was fixed on the old man, like a compass finding north. On the man's stillness, on his bearing, on the thousand small details that screamed military to anyone who knew how to look. "What is your name?" Vincent asked quietly. Earl considered the question, considered the man asking it, considered all the years he had spent invisible, forgotten, dismissed. Then he answered. "Cafferty," he said. "Earl Cafferty." Vincent Hargrave's face went pale. His hand shot out to grip the back of the nearest chair, steadying himself against a sudden wave of memory. The dining room waited, and somewhere in the silence, the truth began its slow climb toward the surface. Vincent's knuckles had gone white against the chair back. The name echoed in his skull like a bell struck in an empty cathedral. Cafferty. Earl Cafferty. It could not be. It was impossible. That man was a legend. That man was a ghost story told in officer training, a name whispered in the dark corners of naval bases from Coronado to Norfolk. That man was supposed to be dead. "Mr. Hargrave," Brittany said again, her voice uncertain now. "Is everything okay?" Vincent did not answer. He was 33 years old again, choking on smoke and sand in the Iraqi desert, pinned beneath the twisted wreckage of a Humvee, while gunfire cracked the air above him. He was screaming for help that would not come. He was watching his men die around him. He was certain, absolutely certain, that this was where his story ended. And then a voice in the darkness. Calm, steady, carrying the absolute authority of a man who had walked through hell so many times he had stopped fearing the flames. "Hold on, Lieutenant. I am getting you home." Hands had gripped him. Strong hands. Scarred hands. hands that pulled him from the wreckage with a strength that seemed impossible for any human being. He remembered being dragged through gunfire, remembered the impact of rounds striking the sand inches from his head, remembered a silhouette standing over him and returning fire with mechanical precision while calling for extraction. He remembered a face leaning close in the helicopter. Weathered, calm, eyes that had seen everything and still chose to keep fighting. Stay with me, son. That is an order. Vincent had stayed. He had survived. He had gone home to his daughters and his wife and his life, all because a Master Chief he had never met before chose to cross 200 meters of open desert under enemy fire to pull a junior officer from a burning vehicle. He had spent 30 years trying to find that man, trying to thank him. Every lead went cold. Every inquiry hit a wall of classified documents and redacted files. The official record said only that a SEAL team had been operating in the area, that casualties were sustained, that the mission was successful. No names, no details, just ghosts doing ghost work and disappearing back into the shadows. And now one of those ghosts was sitting in his restaurant, being accused of theft by a waitress who did not know enough to be ashamed. "Sir," Vincent said, and his voice cracked on the word. He cleared his throat, tried again. "Sir, did you serve in Desert Storm?" Earl studied him for a long moment. The question was not casual. The question was a key turning in a lock that had been sealed for decades. "I serve in a lot of places," Earl said carefully. "Some of them are on the record. Most of them are not." Vincent released the chair and took a final step forward, closing the distance between them. His eyes were wet. His hands were trembling. "February 1991, he said. Outside Basra, a convoy was ambushed. 17 men trapped. 14 wounded. The extraction was supposed to be impossible." Earl's expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes. A door opening onto a room he had kept locked for 30 years. Vincent pressed on, his voice barely above a whisper now. "I was a lieutenant then, 23 years old. Thought I knew everything." He laughed bitterly. "I did not know anything. I did not know that war was real until I was burning alive and watching my friends die." The dining room had become a hell breath. Even Brittany had stopped moving, frozen by the raw emotion in her employer's voice. "A SEAL team came for us," Vincent continued. "They were not supposed to be there. We were not their mission. But they came anyway, lost 2 men getting us out. And their leader, their Master Chief, he pulled me from the wreckage himself, carried me 200 meters under fire, saved my life." He paused, steadying himself. "I spent 30 years looking for that man. 30 years trying to say thank you. And I never found him. Because men like that do not exist in any official record. They just exist in the nightmares of the enemies they defeated and the memories of the men they saved." Earl sat very still. The rose on the table seemed to glow in the ambient light, a spot of color in a world gone gray. Vincent reached up and loosened his tie with shaking fingers. "That Master Chief had a tattoo," he said, "on his forearm. Coordinates of every operation where he lost men. Initials of every fallen brother beneath them. He said it was so he would never forget. So he would carry them with him always." Earl's hand moved unconsciously to his left forearm, pressing against the fabric of his sleeve. Vincent saw the movement. His breath stopped. "Sir," he said, and now there were tears running openly down his face. "Sir, I need to see your arm." The request hung in the air between them. 30 years of searching, 6 years of grief, 43 years of marriage reduced to a wilted rose and a worn photograph. A lifetime of service condensed into faded ink on weathered skin. Earl looked at this man, this stranger who was weeping in the middle of his own restaurant, and saw something he had not seen in a very long time. He saw himself, 30 years younger, standing at the edge of a burning vehicle and making a choice. The mission or the men, the objective or the oath. In that moment, there had been no choice at all. You did not leave people behind. That was not who they were. That was not what the trident meant. Slowly, deliberately, Earl reached for his sleeve, and the room held its breath as the truth prepared to surface. Earl's fingers paused at the cuff of his sleeve. The fabric was stiff with years of wear, frayed at the edges, holding together through stubbornness more than thread. He had rolled this sleeve up 10,000 times. In jungles, in deserts, in waters so cold they burned. But never like this. Never with a room full of strangers watching. Never with the weight of recognition pressing down on him like a physical force. Vincent stood motionless, tears still wet on his cheeks, waiting. Brittany had retreated 3 steps, her earlier confidence evaporating like morning fog. She did not understand what was happening, but she understood enough to know that the ground beneath her feet had shifted in ways she could not yet comprehend. Pastor Okonkwo had finally reached the edge of Earl's table. He stood silently, bearing witness, his chaplain's instincts telling him this moment was sacred. Earl looked at the rose on the table, at Margaret's face in his memory, at the empty chair where she should have been sitting. She would have told him to show them. She would have said that hiding helped no one, that the men who died deserved to be remembered, that carrying them in secret was a burden he had never been asked to bear alone. "All right," Earl said quietly. He rolled up his sleeve. The tattoo emerged from beneath the grime, and weathering like a map rising from deep water. Coordinates first precise to the 5th decimal, etched in ink that had faded but never disappeared. Beneath them, dates, and beneath the dates, initials. Row after row of initials, some crisp and clear, others blurred by scar tissue where the skin had been torn and healed and torn again. Vincent made a sound that was not quite a word. His hand flew to his mouth. At the bottom of the tattoo, larger than the rest, a trident, the mark of the Navy SEALs, and curving beneath it, 2 letters that made Vincent's knees buckle. T.R. Tommy Reyes, the man who had died in Earl's arms in Grenada, the man whose dog tags still hung around Earl's neck, the man whose son Earl had taught to fish every summer for 15 years. Vincent gripped the edge of the table to keep himself upright. His voice came out broken, barely a whisper. "Those coordinates. The first set. I know those coordinates." Earl nodded slowly. "That is where you found us," Vincent said. "That is where you saved us." Earl said nothing. The coordinates spoke for themselves. 30.5159 degrees north, 47.7838 degrees east. A patch of desert outside Basra that existed on no official map. A place where 17 men should have died and did not. A place where 2 SEALs gave their lives so that strangers could go home. Vincent's eyes moved down the list of initials. So many names compressed into letters, so many stories ended, so many families shattered. And this man had carried them all, had inked them into his skin so he would never forget, had borne the weight of their memory for decades while the world forgot he existed. The dining room remained frozen. Sophia Chin's phone trembled in her hand, still recording, capturing history she did not yet understand. The other diners sat in stunned silence, their meals abandoned, their evening transformed into something none of them had anticipated. Pastor Okonkwo spoke first. His voice was gentle, reverent, the voice he used for hospital bedsides and graveside services. "Master Chief," he said softly, "how long have you been carrying this alone?" Earl looked at him, looked at the trident on the pastor's business card, still sitting on the table, looked at the kindness in his eyes that asked for nothing in return. 6 years, Earl said, "since my wife passed." But he shook his head slightly. "That is not true. I have been carrying it since 1983, since the first time I lost a brother and could not save him." Pastor Okonkwo nodded slowly. "I served 20 years as a Navy chaplain," he said. "I heard stories about a master chief they called Undertow. Said he never lost a man he could reach. Said he would swim through hell itself to bring his people home." The name landed in the silence like a stone dropped into still water. Undertow. Earl had not heard that call sign spoken aloud in years, had almost forgotten it himself, buried beneath layers of grief and isolation and the slow erosion of identity that came with being invisible. Brittany's face had gone white. Her hands trembled at her sides. The magnitude of her mistake was beginning to dawn on her, rising like floodwater, threatening to drown everything she thought she knew about the world and her place in it. "Mr. Hargrave," she started. "I did not know. I could not have known. He looked like—" She stopped. The words died in her throat. Because what could she say? He looked like what? Like someone who did not matter. Like someone who could be dismissed and degraded without consequence. Like someone whose appearance told the whole story. Vincent turned to her slowly. His face was not angry. It was something worse. It was disappointed in a way that cut deeper than any rage. He looked like a man, Vincent said quietly. That should have been enough. Brittany's eyes filled with tears. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Earl raised one hand slightly. A gesture of peace. A gesture that had once called off airstrikes and halted firefights and brought enemies to negotiating tables. She did not know, he said. His voice carried no accusation, no bitterness, no triumph. Just a simple statement of fact. Most people do not know. Most people cannot see past what is in front of them to what lies beneath. Vincent shook his head. That is not an excuse. No, Earl agreed. It is not, but it is an explanation. And sometimes understanding why people fail is the first step toward helping them do better. The words hung in the air, simple and profound. A man who had been publicly humiliated, accused of theft, treated as less than human, was now offering grace to the person who had wronged him. Pastor Okonkwo smiled softly. That sounds like something a chaplain would say. Earl almost smiled back. I have known a few good ones over the years. The tension in the room began to shift, transforming from confrontation into something else. Something warmer. Something that felt like the first light of dawn after a very long night. But they were not done yet. The revelation had only begun. And what came next would bring Vincent Hargrave to his knees. Vincent could not stop staring at the tattoo. His eyes traced each coordinate, each date, each set of initials like a man reading scripture. The history of a warrior mapped in flesh and ink. The cost of service made permanent and visible. Master Chief, he said, and his voice broke on the title. I need to know something. Earl waited. He had learned patience in places where impatience meant death. He could wait for whatever question this man needed to ask. Vincent swallowed hard. The 2 men you lost getting us out. The 2 SEALs who died, so my convoy could live. He paused, steadying himself. What were their names? The question landed on Earl like a physical blow. His hand moved to his chest, pressing against the chain beneath his shirt. The tags. Always the tags. Petty Officer First Class David Chun, Earl said quietly. Petty Officer Second Class Marcus Webb. David was 29. Marcus was 24. David had a wife in San Diego and twin girls he had never met. They were born while we were in country. Marcus was engaged. Wedding was supposed to be 3 weeks after he got home. Vincent's face crumpled. He had carried the weight of those deaths for 30 years without knowing their names, without being able to honor them properly, without being able to tell their families that their sacrifice had meant something. I tried to find out, Vincent whispered. I tried for years. Everything was classified. No one would tell me anything. Earl nodded slowly. That is how it works. We do the job. The job disappears. And the men who do not come home become ghosts that only we can see. He reached up and pulled the chain from beneath his shirt. 3 sets of tags emerged, clinking softly against each other. His own, Tommy's from Grenada, and a 3rd pair, older, the metal worn smooth by decades of handling. These belong to Marcus Webb, Earl said. His mother gave them to me at the memorial. Asked me to carry them. Said she wanted her boy to keep serving even after he was gone. Vincent made a sound that was half sob, half prayer. His knees began to buckle. Pastor Okonkwo stepped forward and gripped his arm, steadying him. Easy, brother, the pastor murmured. I have got you. But Vincent was not finished. He pulled away gently, took 1 step forward, and then did something that silenced every remaining whisper in the dining room. He dropped to his knees, not in weakness, not in collapse, in reverence. The way a man kneels before an altar. The way a soldier kneels before a fallen brother's grave. Master Chief Earl Cafferty, Vincent said, his voice ringing clear despite the tears. On behalf of every man you brought home. On behalf of every family who got to hold their sons and husbands and fathers again because of you. On behalf of myself and my daughters and the 30 years of life you gave me. He bowed his head. Thank you. The words echoed through the restaurant like a benediction. Thank you. 2 words that carried the weight of 17 lives. 2 words that acknowledged sacrifices most people would never know were made. 2 words that broke through 30 years of silence and secrecy and found their target at last. Earl looked down at the kneeling man. His own eyes had grown wet, though his face remained composed. He had been thanked before in classified debriefs and anonymous commendations, but never like this. Never in public. Never by someone who truly understood what the thanks was for. Stand up, son, Earl said gently. You do not kneel to me. Vincent shook his head, still bowed. With respect, Master Chief, I will kneel to whoever I choose. And I choose to kneel to the man who gave me back my life. A sound rose from the dining room. Soft at first, then growing. Applause. Not the polite applause of a dinner crowd entertained by a show. Something deeper. Something that came from the chest rather than the hands. 1 person, then 5. Then every diner in the restaurant was on their feet, clapping, some wiping tears from their eyes. Sophia Chun had lowered her phone. She was no longer recording. She was simply witnessing her food blog forgotten, her followers irrelevant. Some moments were not meant to be content. Some moments were meant to simply be. A man at a nearby table, silver-haired and straight-backed, raised his hand in a salute. He wore no uniform, but his bearing spoke of service. Army, perhaps, or Marines. It did not matter. He recognized a brother, and he honored him the only way he knew how. Another man followed, then a woman 3 tables over, her posture snapping to attention with muscle memory that had never faded. Earl stood slowly. The room watched as he straightened, as the homeless man in the stained peacoat transformed before their eyes into something else entirely. His shoulders squared, his chin lifted. The warrior emerged from beneath the wreckage of grief and loss and years of invisibility. He returned the salutes with crisp precision. His hand trembled slightly, but his form was perfect. 34 years of service encoded in a single gesture. At ease, he said quietly. The words were automatic, a reflex from decades of command. But they carried, and the salutes lowered, and something in the room settled into a new configuration. Vincent finally rose from his knees. His face was streaked with tears, but he was smiling. A smile of relief, of completion, of a 30-year wound finally beginning to heal. Master Chief, he said, I have one more question. Earl raised an eyebrow slightly. Vincent gestured at the terrible table by the kitchen doors, at the cold soup and the wilted rose and the worn photograph barely visible in Earl's coat pocket. Why tonight, he asked. Of all nights, why did you come here tonight? Earl was quiet for a long moment. His hand found the chain again, the tags, the ring. The anchors that had kept him alive when everything else had fallen away. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. But in the silence of the watching room, every word carried. 43 years ago tonight, he said, I asked my wife to marry me. Right here, in that corner booth. He nodded toward the booth he had originally requested, the one Brittany had deemed too good for him. She said yes before I finished the question. His voice caught. He steadied himself. She died 6 years ago. Cancer. And every year since, on our anniversary, I come back here. Just to remember. Just to sit where we sat and feel her close to me again. He looked at the wilted rose on the table. I walked 3 miles in the rain to get here. Spent the last of my money on soup and wine. He almost smiled. She would have laughed at me for that. Would have said I was being dramatic. The room was utterly silent. Even the kitchen had gone quiet. The staff gathered at the doorway, listening. Vincent Hargrave looked at the corner booth. At the best table in his restaurant. At the seat he had reserved for special guests since the day he bought this place. And he understood, finally, why some seats are not just furniture. Some seats are sacred ground. Vincent moved before anyone else could speak. He crossed to the corner booth with purposeful strides, pulled out the chair facing the door, and stood beside it like a sentinel. Master Chief, he said, this is your table. Tonight and every night for as long as I own this restaurant. Earl did not move. He looked at the booth, at the leather seats where he and Margaret had sat 43 years ago, at the window that looked out over the harbor where the lights reflected on black water like scattered stars. "I cannot accept that," he said quietly. "I do not need charity." Vincent shook his head. "This is not charity, Master Chief. This is a debt being paid. A small one. Nowhere near what I owe you. But it is a start." He gestured again to the chair. "Please, let me do this. My daughters are alive because of you. My grandchildren exist because of you. Every birthday and graduation and wedding that my family has celebrated for the past 30 years happened because you made a choice in the desert to save men you had never met." His voice cracked. "Let me give you a chair. It is not enough. It will never be enough. But let me give you this." Earl stood motionless. The dining room watched, breath held, as the old man wrestled with something internal. Something that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with worth. For 6 years, he had believed he deserved nothing, had punished himself for surviving when Margaret did not, had walked away from his son, from comfort, from any hand extended in kindness. He had convinced himself that suffering was penance, that grief was a debt that could only be paid in solitude. But Margaret's voice whispered in his memory, the last words she ever spoke. "Take care of yourself, Earl. Promise me." He had broken that promise every day since her death, had worn the breaking like a hair shirt, a constant reminder of his failure. But standing here in this restaurant, surrounded by strangers who had become witnesses to something larger than any of them, he wondered if maybe he had misunderstood. Maybe taking care of himself did not mean suffering alone. Maybe it meant letting people in. Pastor Okonkwo stepped forward. He did not speak. He simply placed one hand on Earl's shoulder. The touch was light, asking nothing, offering everything. Earl looked at him, at Vincent still standing by the corner booth, at Sophia Chun with tears streaming down her face, at the veterans who had saluted him, still standing at attention as if waiting for orders, at Brittany, pale and trembling, her earlier cruelty transformed into something that looked almost like shame. He looked at all of them, and he made a choice. Slowly, with the deliberate grace of a man who had learned to move through minefields, Earl walked to the corner booth. Each step seemed to cost him something. Each step seemed to give him something back. He reached the table and paused, his scarred hand resting on the back of the chair. The same chair Margaret had sat in when she said yes. The same chair that had been empty for 6 years, waiting for someone who would never return. Earl sat down. The room exhaled. Vincent signaled to the kitchen with a sharp gesture. "Whatever the Master Chief wants," he said, his voice carrying. "On the house. Tonight and always." A server who was not Brittany appeared almost instantly, a young man with nervous hands and wide eyes. He set down a fresh glass of wine, properly polished this time, and a basket of warm bread that smelled like butter and rosemary. "Sir," the young man said, "it is an honor." Earl nodded his thanks. The word honor felt strange applied to him. He had done what needed doing, nothing more. But he accepted it because refusing would diminish what the young man was trying to give. Pastor Okonkwo slid into the seat across from Earl. "May I join you?" he asked. Earl gestured to the chair. The pastor sat, and for a moment neither man spoke. They simply existed together in the silence, two veterans sharing space the way veterans do. No need for words. No need for explanations. Just presence. "I meant what I said earlier," the pastor finally offered. "About my program. No paperwork. No bureaucracy. Just men who have been where you have been, talking to each other." Earl turned the wine glass slowly in his hands. "I have not talked to anyone in a long time," he admitted. "Not really. Not about the things that matter." "That is the hardest part," Raymond agreed. "The talking. We are trained to endure, to push through, to complete the mission no matter what." He paused. "Nobody trains us how to put the mission down, how to come home and stay home." Earl nodded slowly. The words resonated in places he had kept locked for decades. Chambers of his heart that he had sealed shut because opening them hurt too much. "My wife tried," he said. "Margaret. She tried for 30 years to get me talk. I gave her pieces, fragments, never the whole picture. But she stayed," Raymond said. It was not a question. She stayed. Earl's voice was rough. Through all of it, the nightmares, the silences, the times I woke up swinging at shadows. She stayed. He looked at the empty space beside him, where her ghost should have been sitting. And then she left, he whispered. Not by choice, but she left. And I did not know how to exist in a world where she was not there to anchor me. Raymond reached across the table and gripped Earl's forearm. The scarred forearm, the tattooed forearm, the map of loss that Earl had carried for 40 years. You are still here, Raymond said firmly. That means something. That is not an accident. That is not a mistake. Earl met his eyes. For 6 years, he had believed his survival was a punishment, a sentence to be served in solitude. But looking at this man, this stranger who spoke with the certainty of someone who had wrestled the same demons, he felt something crack inside him. Not breaking, opening. I do not know how to start, Earl admitted. I do not know how to come back from where I have been. Raymond smiled gently. Nobody does, brother. That is why we do it together. The words hung in the air, simple and profound. Together. A concept Earl had abandoned 6 years ago. A possibility he had stopped believing in. But sitting here in Margaret's seat, surrounded by people who saw him, he wondered if maybe together was still possible. And across the restaurant, Brittany watched with tears running down her face, because she was beginning to understand that the lesson she had learned tonight would change her forever. The kitchen sent out dishes Earl had not ordered. A ribeye, medium rare, cooked with the precision of a surgical team that understood they were serving royalty. Roasted vegetables glistening with herb butter. A lobster tail split and broiled, the meat white and perfect. Each plate arrived with quiet reverence, placed by servers who seemed to understand they were participating in something larger than a meal. Earl looked at the spread before him. More food than he had seen in months. More abundance than he had allowed himself in years. I cannot eat all of this, he said. Pastor Okonkwo smiled. Then we will share. That is what tables are for. Vincent appeared beside them, having made rounds through the dining room, accepting handshakes and murmured congratulations from customers who seemed to feel they had witnessed something historic. He pulled up a chair from a nearby table and sat at the edge of their booth. Master Chief, he said, there is something I need to tell you. Earl set down his fork. The steak was the best thing he had tasted in 6 years, but old habits ran deep. When a commanding officer used that tone, you listened. Vincent folded his hands on the table. After you saved us in Basra, I made a promise. I swore that if I ever found you, I would make sure you never wanted for anything again. He paused. I have done well for myself. This restaurant, some investments, a good life, all of it built on the 30 years you gave me. Earl shook his head. You do not owe me anything. You built your own life. I built it on a foundation you provided, Vincent countered. Without you, there is no restaurant, no investments, no grandchildren learning to walk. He leaned forward. Let me help you. Not charity. Partnership. I need someone to consult on security for this place. Someone who knows how to assess threats, train staff, protect what matters. The offer hung in the air. Not a handout. Not pity. A job. Purpose. Something to wake up for. Earl was quiet for a long moment. His eyes drifted to the window, to the harbor lights dancing on the water. Margaret had loved this view, had insisted on this table specifically because she could watch the boats come and go while they ate. I have not held a real job in 6 years, Earl finally said. I'm not sure I remember how. Vincent almost laughed. Master Chief, you commanded SEAL teams through 4 decades of combat operations. I think you can handle restaurant security. Raymond leaned back in his chair, watching the exchange with quiet satisfaction. This was what he had dedicated his retirement to. Moments like this. Connections forged. Purposes rediscovered. Men pulled back from the edge one conversation at a time. There is more, Vincent continued. He reached into his jacket and produced a folded document. I made some calls while you were eating. Called in some favors from my Navy days. Earl's eyes narrowed slightly. What kind of calls? Vincent unfolded the paper and slid it across the table. The kind that access records most people cannot see. Earl looked down at the document. It was a service summary. His service summary. 34 years condensed into 2 pages of operations, commendations, and classifications. But there was something else. A section at the bottom he had never seen before. Vincent tapped the page. Did you know about this? Earl read the words slowly. His face did not change, but his hands trembled slightly against the table. Navy Cross, he read aloud. The words felt foreign in his mouth. For actions in Grenada, October 1983. Awarded in absentia. Presented to family representative due to operational security concerns. He looked up. I never received this. Vincent nodded. It was classified. The whole operation was classified. They gave the medal to your emergency contact because you were already deployed on another mission by the time the paperwork cleared. Earl's emergency contact in 1983 had been his mother. She had died in 1995, never mentioning a medal. Perhaps she had not understood what it meant. Perhaps she had been told not to speak of it. Perhaps she had simply put it away and forgotten the way families of quiet professionals learn to put away so many things. There is more, Vincent said gently. Silver Star. Twice. Bronze Star. 3 times. All classified. All awarded in ceremonies you were never present for. All sitting in a box somewhere in the Navy's bureaucratic labyrinth. Earl stared at the paper. 40 years of service. Decorations he had never known existed. Recognition that had been given but never received. It does not matter, he said finally. His voice was rough. I did not do it for medals. I know, Vincent replied. That is exactly why you deserve them. Raymond reached across and gripped Earl's shoulder. Brother, he said, this is who you are. This is what you did. The world might not have known, but it is time they did. Earl shook his head slowly. He was not a man who sought recognition, had never been comfortable with praise. The mission was the thing. The men were the thing. Everything else was noise. But sitting here in Margaret's booth, holding proof that his sacrifices had been seen even when he was not there to witness the seeing, something shifted inside him. He had spent 6 years believing he was invisible, believing he had been forgotten, believing that the country he served had moved on without him. But they had not forgotten. They had simply lost him. And now, finally, he had been found. Sophia Chin approached the table slowly, her phone nowhere in sight. She had been watching from across the room, processing everything she had witnessed. Excuse me, she said softly. I do not want to intrude, but I need to ask you something. Earl looked up at her, the young woman with the food blog, the one who had been recording everything until she stopped. The video I took earlier, Sophia said, before I knew who you were, before any of us knew. She paused. I would like to share it, not for views, not for followers, but because I think people need to see how we treat our veterans, how we judge people by their appearance, how wrong we can be. She took a breath. But only if you give me permission. It is your story, your moment. I will not share it without your blessing. Earl considered her for a long moment. The restaurant had gone quiet again, everyone straining to hear his response. What do you think it will accomplish? He asked. Sophia's eyes were bright with conviction. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. Maybe one person will see it and think twice before judging someone. Maybe one veteran will see it and realize they are not alone. She shrugged. I do not know what it will do, but I know staying silent will not help anyone. Earl looked at Raymond, at Vincent, at the document on the table that proved he had been remembered even when he had been invisible. Share it, he said quietly. If it helps even one person, share it. Sophia nodded, tears forming in her eyes. Thank you, Master Chief. Thank you. She retreated to her table, already composing the words that would accompany the video. Words about dignity, about service, about the hidden heroes walking among us every day. And Earl turned back to his steak, to his wine, to the 2 men who had become something like brothers in the span of a single evening. The night was far from over, but for the first time in 6 years, Earl Cafferty was not facing it alone. Brittany had not moved from her spot near the kitchen doors. She stood frozen, watching the scene at the corner booth unfold like a woman witnessing her own trial. Every laugh that drifted from that table, every clink of glasses, every gesture of brotherhood and belonging, each one was an indictment of what she had done. The other servers moved around her like water around a stone. They did not speak to her, did not look at her. The silent judgment was worse than any words could have been. She thought about leaving, thought about slipping out the back door and never returning. She could find another job, another restaurant, another city where no one knew her name or what she had done tonight. But something held her in place, something that felt uncomfortably like responsibility. Across the dining room, Pastor Okonkwo caught her eye. He did not glare, did not smirk. He simply looked at her with an expression that seemed to see everything she was feeling and understand it completely. Then he nodded toward the corner booth. A small gesture, an invitation. Brittany's heart hammered against her ribs. She could not go over there, could not face the man she had humiliated, could not look into those steady eyes and see the reflection of her own cruelty. But her feet were moving before her mind could stop them. She crossed the dining room slowly, each step heavier than the last. Conversations paused as she passed. Eyes followed her progress. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath as the woman who had started all of this approached the table, where it had transformed into something else entirely. She stopped 3 feet from the booth. Her hands trembled at her sides. Her throat felt like it was filled with sand. Earl looked up at her. His expression was unreadable. Not angry, not smug, just patient. Waiting. "I need to apologize," Brittany said. The words came out cracked and broken. "What I did was wrong. How I treated you was inexcusable. I judged you based on how you looked, and I was cruel, and I—" Her voice failed. Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I am so sorry," she whispered. "I am so sorry." The dining room was silent. Every eye was on the corner booth, on the young woman breaking apart, on the old man who held her fate in his scarred hands. Earl was quiet for a long moment. He looked at Brittany the way he had once looked at young sailors who made mistakes, with assessment, with consideration, with the understanding that everyone fails, but not everyone learns. "Sit down," he said. Brittany blinked. "What?" Earl gestured to an empty chair. "Sit down. You cannot apologize properly while hovering." Brittany looked at Vincent, uncertain. Her employer nodded once, his expression complex. She pulled out the chair and sat, her movements jerky and uncertain. Earl studied her face. The tears, the trembling lip, the genuine anguish that had replaced her earlier contempt. "What is your name?" he asked. "Brittany. Brittany Holloway." Earl nodded. "Brittany, let me tell you something about judgment." She flinched, expecting condemnation. "I have judged people wrongly more times than I can count," Earl said quietly. "In my line of work, a wrong judgment could mean dead teammates, dead civilians, missions failed, and lives lost." He paused. "So I learned to look harder, to see past the surface, to find the truth beneath the appearance." Brittany said nothing. She was afraid to breathe. "You saw an old man in dirty clothes," Earl continued. "You saw someone who did not belong in your world. And you treated me the way you thought such a person deserved to be treated." "I was wrong," Brittany choked out. "I was so wrong." Earl held up one hand, silencing her. "You were wrong," he agreed. "But you're not the first person to make that mistake. And you will not be the last. The question is not whether you were wrong. The question is what you do now." Brittany wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I do not know what to do. I do not know how to make this right." Earl leaned forward slightly. "You cannot make it right. What happened tonight cannot be undone. But you can make tomorrow different. You can look at the next person who walks through those doors, the next person who does not fit your expectations, and you can choose to see them instead of judging them." Pastor Okonkwo spoke up. "There is a verse," he said gently. "Matthew 25, verse 40. Whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." He paused. "The way we treat the vulnerable is the measure of who we really are." Brittany looked at the pastor, then back at Earl. Her face was a mess of tears and smeared makeup, but something had shifted in her eyes, something that looked like the beginning of understanding. "I want to do better," she said. "I do not know how, but I want to try." Vincent cleared his throat. He had been silent throughout the exchange, watching his employee confront the consequences of her actions. Now he leaned forward. "Here is what is going to happen," he said. His voice was firm but not unkind. "You are not fired. The Master Chief asked me to give you a chance to learn, and I'm going to honor that request." Brittany's eyes widened. "Thank you. Thank you so much." Vincent held up a hand. "I'm not finished. Starting next week, You're going to volunteer at Pastor Okonkwo's Veterans Outreach Program. 2 shifts a week. You're going to serve meals to men and women who look exactly like the man you try to throw out tonight. You're going to learn their names, hear their stories, understand what they have given. He fixed her with a hard stare. And maybe, if you pay attention, you will learn to see people instead of appearances. Brittany nodded rapidly. Yes. Yes, I will do it. I will do whatever it takes. Earl watched the exchange with something that might have been approval. The young woman had been cruel, had been thoughtless, had been everything he had learned to expect from a world that had largely forgotten men like him. But she was also young and scared and standing at a crossroads that would define who she became. He reached into his pocket and withdrew the worn photograph. Margaret smiled up at him from 43 years ago, frozen in a moment of perfect joy. My wife volunteered at shelters for 30 years, Earl said quietly. She always said that the measure of a person was not how they treated people who could help them, but how they treated people who could not. He looked at Brittany. Prove her right, he said. Be the person she believed everyone could be. Brittany stared at the photograph, at the beautiful woman smiling beside a young sailor in dress whites, at the love captured in a single frozen moment. I will try, she whispered. I promise I will try. Earl tucked the photograph back into his pocket. That is all any of us can do, he said. Try, every day, and hope that tomorrow we are better than we were today. The words settled over the table like a blessing. Simple, profound, the kind of wisdom that could only come from a man who had walked through fire and emerged carrying the ashes of everyone he could not save. And Brittany Holloway, who had started this evening as the villain of the story, began the long walk toward becoming something else entirely. The evening had transformed into something none of them had anticipated. What began as a quiet anniversary vigil had become a gathering, a communion. Veterans from other tables had migrated toward the corner booth, pulling up chairs, sharing stories, creating a circle of brotherhood that expanded with each passing hour. A retired Army sergeant named Howard recounted his tour in Vietnam. A former Marine named Patricia described her time in Afghanistan. A young man barely out of his 20s, still adjusting to civilian life after 2 deployments, sat quietly and listened to the elders speak. Earl presided over them all without trying to. It was simply who he was. The gravity of a man who had led warriors through impossible darkness, drawing others into his orbit. Pastor Okonkwo watched with quiet satisfaction. This was what his program tried to create. These connections, these moments of shared understanding. He had spent 15 years building something that this single evening had manifested spontaneously. Vincent kept the kitchen open late, kept the wine flowing, kept the staff attentive but unobtrusive. He understood that what was happening at the corner booth was more valuable than any profit margin. Some nights were not about business. Some nights were about debt. And he owed a debt he could never fully repay. Around 10:30, Earl's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was an ancient flip phone, the kind they sold at convenience stores for $20. He had kept it charged more out of habit than expectation. No one called him anymore. He looked at the screen. The number was unfamiliar, but the area code made his heart stop. Seattle. His son Marcus lived in Seattle. Earl stared at the phone as it buzzed again. The conversations around him faded to white noise. The restaurant dissolved. There was only the phone and the number and the 6 years of silence that stretched between him and the boy he had abandoned. Are you going to answer that? Raymond asked gently. Earl's hand trembled as he raised the phone to his ear. Hello. The voice on the other end was thick with emotion. Dad. 1 word. 3 letters. A lifetime of distance compressed into a single syllable. Marcus, Earl breathed. How did you? Sophia Chun, Marcus said. The food blogger. She posted the video an hour ago. It is everywhere, Dad. Everywhere. He paused, and Earl could hear him struggling for composure. I have been looking for you for 6 years. 6 years. And I find out where you are from a video on the internet. Earl closed his eyes. The guilt crashed over him like a wave. The years of silence. The unanswered questions. The son he had left behind because he could not bear to look into eyes that reminded him of Margaret. I am sorry, Earl whispered. Marcus, I am so sorry. The table had gone quiet. The other veterans watched with the stillness of men who understood family wounds, who carried their own regrets, who knew that some battles were fought not on foreign soil, but in the space between fathers and sons. Sorry, Marcus repeated. The word carried weight. Anger, pain, and beneath it all, desperate hope. You left a note, Dad. A note. You told us not to look for you. You told us to live our lives. How are we supposed to do that? How was I supposed to explain to my kids that their grandfather just disappeared? Earl's throat tightened. You have kids. Twins, Marcus said. A boy and a girl. They turned 4 last month. He paused. I named the boy Thomas, after Tommy Reyes, the man you told me about when I was little, the man whose son you taught to fish. The tears came then. Earl could not stop them. They streamed down his weathered face, cutting tracks through the grime, falling onto the white tablecloth like rain. Around him, the veterans looked away, not in discomfort, in respect. Some moments were sacred. Some grief was not meant to be witnessed directly. I thought you would be better off without me, Earl managed. After your mother died, I could not. I did not know how to. Marcus's voice cracked. We needed you, Dad. I needed you. Not the Master Chief. Not the SEAL. Just my father. And you left. I know. Earl's voice was barely audible. I know. And I have regretted it every day since. Silence stretched across the phone line. Across the 3,000 miles between a restaurant on the coast and a home in Seattle, where his son had spent 6 years wondering if his father was alive or dead. When Marcus spoke again, his voice had changed. Softer. The anger still there, but banked. Controlled. The video, he said. The way you handled that woman. The way you spoke to her afterward. He paused. That was the father I remember. The man who taught me that strength was not about power. It was about grace. Earl said nothing. He could not speak past the lump in his throat. I am catching a flight tonight, Marcus continued. I will be there by morning. He paused. Will you still be there? Will you wait for me? The question carried the weight of 6 years. Of a son who had been abandoned once and could not bear to be abandoned again. Earl looked at the corner booth, at Margaret's chair across from him, at the men and women who had gathered around him like family, at the restaurant owner who had knelt at his feet and the pastor who had offered him purpose and the young waitress who was learning to see. He thought about running, the old instinct, the familiar escape, the solitude that had been his companion for 6 years. And then he thought about Margaret, about her last words, about the promise he had broken every day since her death. Take care of yourself, Earl. Promise me. Maybe taking care of himself meant staying. Maybe it meant letting his son find him. Maybe it meant being a grandfather to children he had never met. I will be here, Earl said. His voice was steady now. Certain. I will wait for you, son. For as long as it takes. Marcus exhaled shakily. I love you, Dad. I never stopped. Earl closed his eyes. The words washed over him like absolution. I love you too, he whispered. I never stopped either. I just forgot how to show it. The call ended. Earl lowered the phone slowly, staring at it like it was a grenade that had failed to detonate. Raymond placed a hand on his shoulder. Your son. Earl nodded. He is coming. He paused, still processing. He has children. Twins. He named his boy Thomas. After Tommy Reyes, Raymond said softly. He understood. The weight of names. The way the dead lived on in the children who carried their memory. Earl looked up at the ceiling, blinking back tears. You hear that, Tommy, he whispered. You have a namesake. A little boy in Seattle with your name. The other veterans bowed their heads. A moment of silence for a man who had died 40 years ago and was still being honored by those who survived. And in the corner booth of a restaurant that had become sacred ground, Master Chief Earl Cafferty began to understand that survival was not a punishment. It was a second chance, and his was just beginning. The restaurant closed at midnight, but no one left. Vincent locked the front doors and dimmed the lights, transforming the dining room into something intimate. A sanctuary. The staff who remained did so by choice, gathering at the edges of the room, bearing witness to something they sensed was historic. Earl sat in the corner booth, Margaret's photograph propped against the salt shaker where he could see her face. The wilted rose had been replaced by a fresh one from the kitchen's garnish supply. Small gestures, profound meanings. Pastor Okonkwo had made calls of his own. Within an hour, representatives from 3 different veterans organizations had arrived. A woman from the VA who actually seemed to care. A retired admiral who had driven 40 minutes through the night because he heard the name Undertow and refused to believe it until he saw for himself. The admiral stood at attention when he approached the booth. Rear Admiral Catherine Walsh, retired. She was 70 years old, silver-haired, and carried herself with the bearing of someone who had commanded fleets. Master Chief Cafferty, she said. Her voice was formal, but her eyes were wet. I served on the Joint Chiefs Advisory Board in the 90s. Your name came across my desk more times than I can count. Always in connection with the impossible. Always classified beyond my clearance. Earl rose slowly, returning her formality with his own. Admiral. She extended her hand. He shook it. Her grip was firm, her palm calloused in ways that spoke of a life spent working, not just commanding. I made some calls on the drive over, Admiral Walsh continued. Pulled some strings I have not pulled in 20 years. She paused. Your medals, the ones that were never properly presented. I am working on getting them released from classification. Earl shook his head. Admiral, that is not necessary. It is absolutely necessary, she countered. You earned those decorations. You bled for them. The fact that bureaucratic nonsense kept them from reaching you is a failure of the system, not a reflection of your service. She reached into her jacket and withdrew a small velvet box. This, however, I can give you tonight. She opened the box. Inside, resting on white satin, was a challenge coin. But not just any challenge coin. This one bore the seal of the President of the United States. Admiral Walsh held it out to him. Given to me by the Commander-in-Chief for 30 years of service, she said. I want you to have it. Earl stared at the coin. I cannot accept that. You can, she said firmly. And you will. Because the men and women who serve do not always get recognized by the system. But we can recognize each other. We can honor our own. She pressed the coin into his palm and closed his fingers around it. Welcome home, Master Chief. It is long overdue. The words hit Earl like a physical force. Welcome home. 2 words he had not heard in 6 years. 2 words he had convinced himself he did not deserve. He looked at the coin in his hand. At the admiral who had driven through the night to deliver it. At the room full of people who had gathered to honor a man they had only just met. For 6 years, he had believed he was invisible, forgotten, a ghost haunting the margins of a world that had moved on without him. But he had been wrong. The world had not moved on. The world had simply lost track of him. And now, piece by piece, connection by connection, the world was finding him again. Vincent stepped forward. Master Chief, I have made arrangements. There is a room upstairs, above the restaurant. It is not much, but it is clean and warm, and it is yours for as long as you need it. Earl looked at him. I cannot. You can, Vincent interrupted gently. And you will. Because in approximately 6 hours, your son is going to walk through those doors. And when he does, I want you rested. I want you ready. I want you here. He placed a key on the table. No arguments, he said. Consider it part of your employment package. Security consultant has to live close to the asset he is protecting. Earl picked up the key. The metal was warm from Vincent's hand. Such a small thing. A key. A room. A place to belong. He had not had a place to belong in 6 years. Pastor Okonkwo stood. I will be back in the morning, he said. Before your son arrives. We can talk more about the program. About what comes next. He paused. If you want. Earl nodded slowly. I would like that. Raymond smiled. It was the smile of a man who had seen this transformation before, who knew how fragile it was and how powerful it could become. Get some rest, Master Chief. Tomorrow is the first day of your new life. The gathering began to disperse. The Admiral shook Earl's hand one more time before departing. The veterans who had shared stories exchanged contact information, promising to meet again. The VA representative left her card with specific instructions on how to navigate the system, how to access the benefits Earl had earned but never claimed. Sophia Chin approached last. Her eyes were red from crying, but she was smiling. The video, she said, it has been viewed 2 million times in 3 hours. The comments. She shook her head. People are sharing their own stories. Veterans, families, people who have been invisible and are finally being seen. Earl did not know what to say. He had never sought attention, had spent his entire career in the shadows, doing work that could never be acknowledged. But maybe acknowledgement was not the point. Maybe the point was connection. Maybe the video would help someone else the way this night had helped him. "Thank you," he said simply, "for seeing me." Sophia's smile widened. "Thank you for letting us." She left, and Earl was alone with Vincent. The two men stood in the empty restaurant, surrounded by the debris of an extraordinary evening. Plates not yet cleared, glasses still holding traces of wine. The corner booth where everything had changed. "I do not know how to repay you," Earl said. Vincent shook his head. "You repaid me 30 years ago. Everything since then has been interest on a debt I will never clear." He extended his hand. Earl took it. "Welcome home, Master Chief," Vincent said. "Welcome home." Earl climbed the stairs to the room above the restaurant. It was small but clean, exactly as Vincent had promised. A bed with fresh sheets. A bathroom with running water. A window that looked out over the harbor where the first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the sky. He sat on the edge of the bed and removed his boots. His father's peacoat. The layers he had accumulated over 6 years of survival. The chain came last. He lifted it over his head and held it in his palm. Margaret's ring. His dog tags. Tommy's dog tags. Marcus Webb's dog tags. The weight of the dead. The love of his life. The family waiting to reclaim him. He set the chain on the nightstand and lay back on the bed. The mattress was soft. The pillow was clean. The silence was peaceful rather than empty. For the first time in 6 years, Earl Cafferty fell asleep without dreaming of the men he could not save. He dreamed instead of Margaret, smiling at him across a table in a restaurant where they were young and the whole world was still a promise waiting to be kept. 3 months later, Earl Cafferty walked into the restaurant wearing a pressed shirt and his father's peacoat, freshly cleaned and repaired. The morning light streamed through the windows, catching the brass plaque that now adorned the corner booth. Reserved, Earl and Margaret Cafferty. The letters were small but permanent, etched into metal that would outlast them all. Vincent looked up from the bar where he was reviewing invoices. "Master Chief." "Right on time." Earl nodded. "Old habits." He made his way to the corner booth, carrying a bouquet of flowers from the proper florist 3 blocks over. Real flowers now. Every week. Margaret deserved better than gas station roses, and he could finally afford to give them to her. The job had changed everything. Security consultant sounded simple on paper, but Vincent had expanded the role into something larger. Earl trained the staff in situational awareness, reviewed emergency protocols, consulted on layout and lighting, and every Thursday night, he hosted a dinner for veterans in the private room upstairs. Free meals. No questions. Just men and women who had served, sharing space with someone who understood. Pastor Okonkwo's program had become a second home. Earl spoke at meetings now, not about his medals or his operations or the classified missions that had shaped his life. He spoke about Margaret, about grief, about the 6 years he had spent running from help because he believed he did not deserve it. The young veterans listened with hungry eyes. They saw themselves in his story. They saw possibility in his recovery. And slowly, one conversation at a time, they began to believe that maybe they could find their way back too. Brittany arrived at 8 sharp, tying her apron as she crossed the dining room. "Morning, Master Chief." "Morning, Brittany." She had changed in 3 months. The brittle confidence had softened into something genuine. Her volunteer shifts at the Outreach Center had become the highlight of her week. She knew the regulars by name now, knew their stories, knew the weight they carried and the grace required to help them carry it. She paused at Earl's booth. "Your son called. Said they landed safely. Should be here within the hour." Earl smiled. The expression still felt unfamiliar on his face, but it was coming more easily now. "Thank you." Brittany nodded and headed toward the kitchen. She had apologized 100 times in the weeks after that first night. Earl had forgiven her 100 times in return. Eventually, she had stopped apologizing and started proving. That was the better path. That was the path Margaret would have wanted. The door opened at 9:15. Earl heard them before he saw them. The excited chatter of children. The patient voice of a father managing chaos. The sound of family. Marcus appeared first, holding the door for his wife Elena and the twins. Thomas and Maria, 4 years old, named for ghosts who had become guardians. Earl rose from the booth. His throat tightened. His hands trembled. But he did not run. He had done enough running for one lifetime. Dad! Marcus crossed the restaurant in 3 strides and pulled Earl into an embrace that 6 years of silence could not diminish. The twins hung back, uncertain, clutching their mother's hands. Earl held his son, felt the strength in him, the man he had become despite his father's absence. "I am sorry," Earl whispered. The words had become a ritual between them. Not because Marcus needed to hear them, but because Earl needed to say them, needed to acknowledge the wound so it could continue healing. "I know," Marcus replied. "I forgive you." Again, they separated, and Earl knelt down to face the twins. His knees protested, but he ignored them. Some moments required being at eye level. "You must be Thomas," he said to the boy, "and you must be Maria." The children stared at him with wide eyes. They had seen photographs, had been told stories, but this was the first time they had met their grandfather in person. Thomas spoke first, emboldened by 4-year-old courage. "Daddy says you were a superhero. In the water." Earl glanced at Marcus, who shrugged with a half-smile. "I was a sailor," Earl said carefully. "I swam a lot. Sometimes I helped people." Maria tugged her hand free from her mother and took a step closer. She studied Earl's face with the intensity only children possess. "Do you have a cape?" she asked. Earl almost laughed. "No cape. Just flippers." Maria considered this. She reached out and touched the chain around his neck, visible now above his collar. The ring, the tags, the weight of everything he carried. "What is this?" she asked. Earl covered her small hand with his own. "This is how I remember the people I love," he said. "Your grandmother. Some friends who are not here anymore." He paused. "And now I have room for 2 more. He looked at Marcus. "Your father gave me these a month ago." He lifted the chain to show 2 new additions. Small medallions, barely bigger than a thumbnail, engraved with the names Thomas and Maria. Maria's eyes went wide. "That is my name." "That is your name," Earl confirmed. "So I can carry you with me wherever I go." Thomas pushed forward, wanting to see. His name was there too, right next to the name of the man he had been named for, connected across 40 years by memory and metal and love. Elena wiped tears from her eyes. Marcus put an arm around her. "Welcome to the family, Dad," Marcus said. "Finally, if this story moved you, if it reminded you that second chances are possible and that heroes walk among us in the most unexpected forms, please consider subscribing to this channel and share in the comments. Who is the quiet hero in your life? Who deserves to be seen? Sometimes the greatest warriors are not the ones in uniform. Sometimes they're the ones we walk past every day without knowing what they carry. Thank you for watching. Earl led his family to the corner booth. Margaret's booth. Their booth. He set the flowers in the center of the table and slid into his usual seat with his back to the wall and his eyes on the door. But now the door did not represent escape. It represented arrival. The people he loved walking through. The life he had almost lost walking back to him. Thomas climbed into the seat next to him. Maria claimed the other side. Marcus and Elena settled across the table, in the chairs where Margaret should have been sitting. But Margaret was here. Earl could feel her, in the light through the windows, in the laughter of grandchildren she never got to meet, in the son who had forgiven what should have been unforgivable. "Still here, sweetheart," Earl whispered, touching the ring beneath his shirt. Still trying. But he was not just trying anymore. He was living. And every Thursday night, when the veterans gathered upstairs and the stories flowed and the wounds began to heal, Master Chief Earl Cafferty would raise his glass to the empty chair at the head of the table. To the ones who did not make it home, he would say, and to the ones still finding their way. The toast became tradition. The tradition became legacy. And the legacy became proof that no one, no matter how lost, was ever truly invisible. Some tables are not just furniture. Some tables are sacred ground. And some old men in worn coats are not burdens to be removed. They are monuments to be honored. Still here, still trying. And finally, After 6 long years of wandering, Earl Cafferty was home.